Can you make it so I can share?
You should already go. Go ahead. Go ahead and introduce yourself and take it away.
Okay. My name is Rick Watson. I model the SP Exeter branch. I've been running the layout for around 11 years. We're coming up on 250 operating sessions. It just finished session 248. So I thought it might be interesting for folks to see the evolution of where we've gone with the railroad, some lessons learned, and just kind of give you a perspective. I know there are a few folks on the line that have operated on the railroad. And we've been having a really good time. So let me share my screen. My Zoom just went wacky. So you guys can see my presentation, correct?
Yep, it looks fine.
Okay. So I just talked through my title slide. So what I'm going to talk about today is about the Exeter branch, the evolution, how I came across building the railroad, some of the changes that I've gone through for ops. This railroad was designed for operations exclusively. I did go through a backdating process, operating schema changes, and then hopefully we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes left at the end for questions. So a little bit more about me. I've been a model railroader since I was 5. My first train set was Lionel. Ironically, it was a Lionel Santa Fe F unit set. How I ended up as a Southern Pacific modeler when I started with my roots there in Santa Fe, I don't know, but no regrets. I grew up in Southern California, in the Ventura area, and then in the Orange County area. So that's really where I got my teeth cut on Southern Pacific. And for the last 25 years, I've been in Tempe, Arizona. As a teenager, I worked at a hobby shop. I did custom painting of brass, which was great. My first 2 years of college, I didn't have a real job. All I did was custom painting. The downside to that is I don't have anything to show for it because all the work went out the window or went to customers. I was introduced to operations in 2001. We moved into the neighborhood that I'm in now. Shortly after that, there was a neighborhood party and they said, come see a basement full of trains. And I went, a basement full of trains, wow. Went over to the open house. His name was Jim Nomiller. He was building a 2-level Great Northern layout in a rather large basement. And went down there and they introduced or showed me how to do operations, went through it, and the hook was set. I really enjoyed the puzzle solving aspect, the problem solving. You know there's an end point. It's just how do you go about getting there and how efficiently can you get there? So other hobbies that I have, I'm into motorcycles, doing some car restoration, what seems to be the endless home remodeling project because I'm doing most of the work myself. Here's a picture of my wife and I. My wife Jennifer does operate. We've been married for just a little over 7 years, and she's been operating. Well, I said she started operating because that was part of the hook of catching me, but she's continued. So clearly that just wasn't her only motivation. So about the SP Exeter branch. I built it in 2009. It went from 11 months from the concept to the first op session. I had a life change, if you will, and ended up with a spare area down in my basement. And I decided, wow, I could build a railroad now. And so I really struggled with where I was going to do. I knew I wanted to model the SP. I knew I wanted to have something that was switching. And I went to the SP Historical Society convention in Bakersfield around that time. I think it was in 2008. And a man named Jim Lancaster presented on the packing houses in the San Joaquin Valley in California. And I found out, wow, that would fit what I want to accomplish with the railroad. So that was really how I ended up coming up with the Exeter branch. It's based in the San Joaquin Valley, as I said, and the era was 1980. So a lot of 57-foot mechanical reefers, 50-foot boxcars, 50 and 60-foot flats, etc. Again, it was designed for switching, and I used the SP SPINS diagram. So the SPINS diagram, for those who don't know, is the Southern Pacific Industrial Numbering System. And basically, it's a book that all the crews would get, and it laid out the diagrams for each of the towns. So I was able to get the SPINS books for the area that I was modeling, and then I compressed it. I wanted to make it a switching layout. I wanted to make it challenging, a bit of a puzzle. But what I found is that about 90 to 95% of the industries are actual real industries that were on the SP. There's a few fictitious ones for personal reasons. but fundamentally it's all based on the prototype. So when I got the railroad started, I created 4 jobs. And here's a line diagram of the railroad. It is point to point. There's no option for continuous running. I also, when I designed it, I designed the bench work so that there wouldn't be any duck udders. I didn't want to do that. And I tried to make the aisles a minimum of 3 feet wide. Model railroaders tend to get a little wider over time as opposed to anything else. And I have some of my crew members, I wanted to make sure they could get through. So below is a list of the 4 jobs that were there. The Sanger Switcher, which is a captive job. The Reedley Runner, which runs to and from Fresno staging for 2 turns. The Exeter Local, which serves the local towns within Exeter, and then the Red Banks turn. So the railroad was operating or getting ready to operate, but I had to make some, let me back up. So in the design of the railroad, I had to make some decisions. So what was my benchwork height? I came up with 46 inches. I had to look at what my operating crew, who my operating crew were, what the heights were of that crew, and it was all across the spectrum. I'm 6'2", so I would have normally done it a little bit higher, but I wanted to make sure that I could accommodate everybody. And my benchwork depth is 30 inches. To some, 30 inches seems a little deep, but you never end up with the track all the way up against the backdrop. So it usually ends up in the 24 to 27 inch range as far as reach goes. I designed the whole railroad with Microsoft Visio. I love Visio for railroad design. It's not as precise as a 3D CAD or something like that, but it actually works out very well because I've also found that as you start to lay the track, you make adjustments as you go. So I designed that. I designed a couple local railroads with it. And then my new railroad, which I'm building as well, was designed in Visio. Track work, I made the decision, it's all Atlas track, code 83. A lot of number 4 turnouts, mostly 4s, but 6s. And then there's, I think, 4 Walthers code 83 curved turnouts. The main track is homobed, so I was able to secure homobed before the California roadbed guy up and vanished. And then I laid everything with that Alex plus Hulk. I really like it. I laid the roadbed down, I laid the track down. A lot of the track is direct on the bench work. I've actually had to make some changes and found that it worked out really, really well to bring it up and not damage the track and allow me to reuse it. Manual ground throws, so the Caboose 202s, because they have the spring. And honestly, there are occasions where you can run turnouts on the railroad and the ground throws have enough give that it doesn't always derail the equipment. Now, let's be honest, there's more derailments than there aren't, but nonetheless. And then powered turnouts, the only place I use that is in the Fresno staging where it's just not reachable. So there's a control panel down at the end of the main peninsula. I decided to use 4 cycle waybills. So cycles 1 and 3 are inbound, cycles 2 and 4 are outbound. There is no classification yard on the railroad, so classification happens during my staging process. Electrical, did 14 gauge bus wires. One thing that I was really adamant about was feeders for every piece of track. So electrical reliability, I thought was very, very important. And I prior to building the railroad, I traveled a lot. I've been to some pro rails, been to operating events throughout the country. And I really benefited from the fact that I learned a lot from going to those railroads. Some of the things I liked and wanted to include, some things I chose that, I don't really want to do it that way. But nothing's more frustrating for an operator than a railroad that doesn't operate well. And so I really strived on reliability of track work, rolling stock, and most importantly, electrical. Part of my design is there's a different power, separate power district for each job. So the jobs run pretty independent of one another unless you're going to staging. So in most cases, if you short yourself out, you're shorting out just your power district. You're not causing other operators to stop. I use NCE, DCC, wired throttles, and now I'm on radio. Manual bamboo skewers for uncoupling, car card boxes. So that was the decision that I had to make. I prefer to have a box per industry as opposed to set out, pick up, and holds. I find it a little bit easier. I prefer it. I actually had some car card boxes made, and they're scattered throughout the railroad. 5 staging tracks. The old adage, you can never have enough staging. Well, I wish I could have had more staging, but 5 was my limit based on the space and the design. And then original train lengths were 13 cars. So that kept us pretty busy during a session. the operator would do 26 cars in and 26 cars out, so 52 cars during a session. And then one compromise I had to do, it's all 4-axle motive power. My ruling radius is around 24 inches to get what I wanted to accomplish into this space. So the 6-axle power just sits in the boxes, unfortunately. So what did I do to prepare for the first op session? Create the jobs and the job descriptions, create spins diagrams for each town in the spirit of the prototype. And here's an example of the spins for the town of Lindsay. You can see I did an angle-based diagram. You've got the different industries and the tracks marked. Label the towns on the fascia, so make it so the operators can see things easily. Assign the labels, label the card boxes, create the waybills, and so things that I consider: what's the capacity of each industry, how many set outs, holds, pickups, etc., and what's the balance. Now, one thing I do is I've used the first in, first out system. So my regular operators like to gripe, well, it's always the deep car. So, but that's how it works in in the real world. So. I created tents for each industry, not knowing what the track plan would evolve to what I need to make changes. It was much easier to make just paper tents. Gathered all the rolling stock and locomotives, of course, made sure it was all quality controlled. I had to create the car cards. So I used both the Waybill program and the car card program. They're Excel based. I think it came out of Germany. I did some modifications to fit my needs. So, but I generated the car cards, caboose cards, header cards, and of course, off-spot cards. Got coupler picks, staged the railroad. So that was quite quite an interesting task, because you're having to harvest the equipment and then figure out where you want to put it on the railroad, and then invite the operators. And what I found was it's better to have experienced operators for the shakedown session. And that's what I did with my first two. They were really shakedown sessions, setting the expectation that, hey, it's brand new railroad, it's coming up, things are going to be problematic. And so what I thought would be prudent is to not try to educate operators on how to operate as part of that. And that way I can get a better feedback mechanism too. So here's a look at my paperwork. You can see an inbound car and an outbound car. Outbound cars, the real trick is look at the via line. If it says via Fresno, that means it's out. Originally, I had via populated both the inbound and outbound, but I listened to my operators, and there was a lot of gnashing of teeth about how confusing it was, because I don't know. If you're doing the town of Sanger and it says Sanger on the waybill, regardless of what the via line says, you should know that it goes to Sanger. However, I thought it would be easier to try to make some changes to accommodate my crews. And then again, I talked about the 4-cycle waybills earlier. There's a good example of loco and caboose cards, and then of course my town placards. Job instructions. So one of the things that I embraced in my philosophy on job instructions is to tell the crews what needs to occur, not how to do it. There are jobs that can be done a dozen different ways. Sure, there are ways that are more efficient and ways that aren't, but let the crews figure out what they want to do. And so as an example, Sanger, which a hauler comes in, I've seen it done probably a dozen different ways on how they process the hauler, because the hauler works as a ping pong. But overall, I think I've found it very, very effective. And then keep the verbiage consistent on the job instructions. Use the same format. Model railroaders aren't really great at reading. I find guest operators read my instructions much better than my regular crews. And I'll get my regular crews and say, well, it never said that before. Well, yeah, it has. You've been operating here for the last few years. So, surprise. There's a off-spot and job cards, and then Fresno routing, and then cards for the 2-switch. The whole railroad it works as a branch line, and it all works as yard limits. So the operators need to cooperate with each other. There's no dispatcher, and it seems to work out pretty well. So as I mentioned, invite experienced operators. You can see on the bottom left, there's a picture of the original railroad as it sits. I painted the benchwork gray because I would later want to come back and do ballast, and the gray would help hide any gaps in the ballast. Got the railroad going. So here's my original crew. 3 of them still operate on the railroad today. The other thing is, don't participate, be available for questions, be available to troubleshoot and fix issues. You really need to make sure that the railroad can run for those first couple of sessions. Have extras on hand. This is common sense: locomotives, rolling stock, throttles, coupler picks, etc. And then get feedback: what went well, what didn't go well, what would they suggest you change, what job was too complex, what job was too simple. Well, after the first session, I did have a problem, and it's the town of Red Banks, which is on the bottom left-hand side. It finished too quickly. I thought it was a fairly intense job, but it turned out that it just got finished too quick. So between the first shakedown session and the second shakedown session, Red Banks expanded. So what that left me was add a new section, which actually was pretty easy based on where the layout orientation was. Redo the job descriptions. So now it's time to print all the waybills again, because cycle 1 and cycle 3 of my waybills go to different destinations. So I was trying to mix up the variety of cards across the railroad. And of course, I needed to get some more park card boxes. So that took us through. We operated for in that way for quite a while. We had our first event, Desert Ops, coming up in 2012. And so some of the things we had to do is figure out when the event was going to be, get our website up, determine the sign-up method. Is it invitation only? Is it first come, first serve? And we settled on the 4th weekend in October. And then I decided to change the Exeter branch. I've done clinics before and tell people don't change before a session. So what did I do? Before we do our first event, I added onto the railroad. So what did I do? I decided that I would change Red Banks to Rich Grove and Joe Vista. I would then go through a closet and come out into another room, which would add a Bakersfield staging and would add a 5th job. So I was running for 2 years, 62 sessions, added the change. It also included adding the Santa Fe in, and it more accurately, in my mind, represented the portion of the railroad. So you can see here in the picture, it goes into the closet and through the hole, and it actually goes in and goes around to the right. And it comes out here in what is now Saco and Oil Junction, with Bakersfield staging at the bottom, and it's co-served by the SP and the Santa Fe. So I added a tank car facility. Some of the industries are shared, some of the industries are being co-served, some of the industries are SP or Santa Fe only. In this diagram, the red represents the Santa Fe. Had to create new job descriptions, and once again, create some more waybills. So I've gotten really good at balancing an Excel spreadsheet of waybills. So for that, I decided that, hey, we've got the Exeter branch running. Now it's 1980, it's Bakersfield staging. We've got the 5th job. It caused me to create 4 more jobs for including the new operator. So Rich Grove got a local and the Saco local as well for the SP, and the same thing for the Santa Fe. So it added a lot more variety. The downside of this job is that when Rich Grove is being worked by the SP, the Santa Fe is working off in Saco and Oil Junction. And if the operators don't finish at relatively the same time, which is usually targeted for the mid session when we take a break, they end up waiting on each other, or one's waiting on the other. And so there have been times where the operator really fell down on one of the jobs and it delayed the other guy. So I vacillate sometimes back and forth on how I want to do that. I've shifted some of my sessions back to 4 operators, but when demand is high, I usually end up doing 5. For events like Desert Ops, we typically do 5. So what did I do next? I decided I was going to backdate. So I am building another railroad. It's Southern Pacific in Los Angeles. I've been fortunate enough to do a very large addition onto my house, and I'm in the process of building that railroad. My blog references at the end of the presentation, and I'm blogging about the railroad, not quite as often as I would like. I got some advice from someone who said you should try to do it at least monthly, and well, that's not happening so well. So I decided I would backdate to 1964 so I could harvest all the cars onto the new railroad. And what that meant is the infusion of ice reavers and 50-foot mechanicals. I increased the train length to 15 cars, and then of course I had to acquire the rolling stock and locos for that area, much of which I already had. And one thing that was an interesting outcome is that the railroad all of a sudden seemed more roomy because I was using shorter cars, because in a sense, and actually in actuality, the number of cars stayed the same, and actually in some cases went up on the railroad, but it seemed more roomy because of the change in car lengths. I found it kind of surprising. Common sense told me, but the experience was a little bit different. So I had to create new car cards. Once again, I'm creating waybills. So I've done a number of different iterations of my waybills. And then after a few sessions, you need to adjust. You always find bubbles that are going around on the railroad. And do you want to keep those bubbles, or do you want to adjust the waybills? And then lastly, I decided to move into a whole waybill simplification process. So traditionally, it took me 2 hours and 45 minutes to stage the railroad for the next operating session. And that involved the classification of cars. I would have friends come over, let them do some of the classification just to give them the opportunity to operate a little bit more. My wife would help out sometimes, but it just got to be kind of a grind. So I ended up making the decision that I was going to move to 2-cycle waybills. And realistically, the way the railroad functions is all the reefers are fundamentally outbound. They come in at night, they get loaded, and then they get picked up, or they get loaded during the day, and they get picked up the next night. And that's how the prototype ran. So I wanted to, I thought about it, and I said, this way I can simplify it, and not all of the mixed freight is outbound every session. So I do believe in holds. I don't want to clean out industry tracks every time, with the exception of reefers. And now I've even implemented reefers that are holds, just to try to mix it up a little bit for my operators. So blocking. A friend of mine was the assistant train master in Fresno, and he came and operated when I had the earlier version of the railroad. And he pointed out to me that per SP practice, if you didn't have your reefers blocked and at the front of your train, you got to spend a little extra time off. So obviously even in the mechanical days, that was a legacy from ICE, because you've got to get the reefers off the train and over to the ICE dock. So what I do, because I have a mix of mechanicals and ICE reefers, they have to be blocked all to the front of the train, but there needs to be an ICE block, and then there needs to be a mechanical block, and the ICE needs to be ahead. So again, that makes the jobs last a little bit longer, makes people have to think about it, because as obviously over time, when you have same crews coming to do your railroad, they get better at it, they get to know the railroad better. And so then you have to look at things. How do I keep my session length approximately the same? So, or at least that's what I'm trying to do. Sanger, one of the things I would do, I started off with haulers, and then I moved to a hauler. So early on, when I started, I had one hauler that would come in that would bring a block of cars, mostly reefers, and the session would start with a cut of 13 cars already sitting in the yard. And I would get operators that were struggling with that because they felt it was just too clogged up with the longer cars. So I ended up creating a second hauler, one for the mixed freight, one for the reefer block. And that's then subsequently evolved. And now we're at a place where they're back to 15 cars in the yard, but they're the shorter cars. The crews have all become more experienced, and then they call for the hauler. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the hauler job gets done multiple ways. A couple of the constraints, it's a ping pong, so it runs to and from Fresno. So you've got to run the power around to take the outbound train, and then it leaves with its caboose. Even though that's in my instructions that the hauler leaves with the caboose, there have been plenty of times a local caboose has been put on, and I make the operators change it. We've got you have to have a few principles. I started off Reedley Dynuba. I was mixing the reefers between the AM turn and the PM turn, and that's now evolved to a reefer block. And then any extra outbound cars beyond the 17 car limit now for the reefer block get put in the mixed freight, and that has to be a mechanical reefer. The ICE reefers need to have priority to go out to be outbound. Exeter has moved or started as an origination point, and then it moved to both coming on to staging. Again, there are two trains that run inbound and out, or 2 inbounds, 2 outbounds for each job. And so with Exeter, what I look at is that it originates there in Exeter. That's where the crew lives. They want to come home and go to dinner every night at their home. So in the morning when the job starts, there's a mixed freight in town that can be switched by the operator, or they can do it later. They need to gather all the reefers, get the reefers to Fresno, then come back with the local train, which is an inbound of reefers, and then make up the late day outbound train, which is the block of the mixed freight. So I don't put a constraint on this has to happen. It can switch all the mixed freight, do all the setouts and pickups of the mixed freight, and then the reefers. But if the reefer block needs to get built and go out before the train can come in from staging. I started creating what I called the PETA train. That's pain in the butt. And the PETA sounded great. Hey, let me run a train through that goes end to end that causes people grief. And it became more of a pain. It became, I thought, too disruptive to the flow. So that was a job that we tried, didn't really work. I wasn't comfortable with what that result was. Oil cans versus oil block. So you can see down at the bottom is the tank car facility. We ran it just that the SP was serving it. That evolved to being co-served by the SP and the Santa Fe. I started to run an oil cans train as an optional train when the session finished. And what I found is it rarely, or for the first operator who finished, and I found that it rarely got run. So that's since changed now. There is a block swap that occurs. So as you can see up in the upper section beyond the oil tanks, there's a string of 9 tank cars. And so when the SP Seco local gets finished, he runs over a light and then swaps out those 9 cars with 9 of the cars in a tank car facility. So the tank car facilities tends to get a lot of activity. Balancing crews, so 5 versus 4. Again, I have the capability of the 5 operators, but there are times where I tone it back, and we have a way that people are assigned the jobs, and I really don't want to take jobs away from people. So it's always tough trying to find that balance. So if I run 4s, usually I run either the SP or the Santa Fe on the new side of the railroad, and then the other 3 jobs, Sanger, Wheatley, Danube, and Exeter all run. That 4 seems to be a little bit easier of a balance. It also is easier for my crew lounge, but right now this quarter we've been running 5s, mostly because of demand. COVID actually, has affected all of us, and we started running at a lot of pent-up demand. So I wanted to get more people involved. Self-selection of operators. So that was one of the things that I learned, that there are some people that just decide that the railroad's not for them, and that's okay. I don't mind. The railroad suits the desires of a number of people, but there are some that just don't find that the railroad that entertaining, and they self-selected themselves. Dropping operators. Here's another problem. I've had a few operators that I've actually had to drop, and that's because they were either hard on equipment, disrespectful for equipment. One of the things I tell folks is that if things break, just tell me something's broken. But I had one guy, and this is in this particular case, he didn't read the job instructions. He pulled all the tank cars out of the tank car facility and was shoving backwards through the closet into Richgrove. And he shoved into some reefers. And of course, the reefers fell off the railroad, and they managed to hit the concrete floor of the closet as opposed to the carpet, and broke the cars. And the guy came around and looked and said, "Oh, wow." And then he walked away. Never got an apology, never an offer to repair or pay. And of course, I wouldn't take any money from anyone, but you should at least make the offer. So that was an example of somebody who ended up not getting invited back. I actually had some others that were doing a lot of 050 switching, and after a few corrections, the habit didn't stop. And we all spend a lot of money and put a lot of effort into our equipment, and don't want them handled. That's why we have the locomotives. Inviting new operators. So I try to keep new operators coming. Not everybody wants to do ops, but I have a continuous flow of new people. We're adding probably 1 to 3 a year. It's nice because it's getting more people out in the community that operate. We have a number of operational layouts here in the Phoenix area, and so get somebody on one layout, then you can get them on another, and again, you're building up your crew base. crew calls and assignments. So I do my crew calls quarterly. I send out an email to everybody saying, here are the dates that we're going to operate. I typically operate on Tuesday nights and do 1 or 2 Saturdays a quarter. So it's usually 6 or 7 sessions per quarter. I ask people to send me their top 3 choices, and then I'll make those assignments based on that, all done via email. One of the things that I found important for me is that in order to keep histories, I do session logging. So I've got an Excel spreadsheet. I use the spreadsheet to manage the assignments for the sessions, what the jobs are that people do. And it just gives me a history about what's going on the railroad. And here's a look at this sheet. This shows that we had 3 sessions, or Q3, we had 6 sessions. This quarter, we're actually having 9, so we're doing some catch up, which will take me to my grand total of 250 for the year. Some operators have decided that they're not going to operate for that quarter. That's where you see the X's. You see people with a bunch of R's. That's because they say, I'm open for any session, but a specific date, or they'll give me their 1, 2, or 3. And I usually try to give everybody their first choice. And the goal is to try to give everybody at least 2 sessions per quarter. It doesn't always work out that way. Now, this year, I've had a lot of extra operating sessions because of what's gone on with COVID. So normally I operate maybe once a quarter. This year, I've operated quite a bit, filling in for the folks. Job selection. So my preference, based on some of the railroads that I've worked on, is I don't want to do seniority. I want everybody to have a chance to operate every job. So we started off by using a method of just cutting cards. I was really proud of myself. I got a deck of SP cards, and that worked for a while, until the one night when we cut cards and 3 people got the Queen of Hearts. So at that point, it just became non-workable. And I always had the one guy who would gripe about, oh, I have the worst card luck. I always end up with a bad pick. So I went to a points-based system. And here's what it is. Usually, I use what people's average score is. The highest amount of points gets first choice. And I do 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. That gives me a little bit better variation in the number. As you can see from the last session, my wife got first pick, but that wasn't because of any influence of hers. That's actually how the numbers worked out for her. So, so far the point systems work pretty good. If I have people that it's a tie score, I usually look at who had the highest operating position for the last session that they attended, and they will get a lower ranking than the person who had a lower session. Some of the more lessons learned, jobs will be refined over time. You may need to change the jobs after a few sessions. Your crews will get to know the railroad and the jobs over time. One thing I've really been trying to focus on is get people to spot cars at doors of industries. Because I'm moving produce, it's not so much this reefer has to go to door number 2, but trying to get people to think about it a little bit more. Don't foul the grade crossings, those sorts of things. Equipment will break, right, or be broken, stirrups, ladders, handrails, etc. Some operators can be very heavy-handed. I use push pins as my track bumpers for a long time. Eventually those will go away. I've had people hit it so hard they've knocked the push pin out of the bench work. And so I kind of cringe. And that's another operator that fortunately self-selected themselves. Wheels need to be clean. My claim to fame is I've never cleaned the track in the 11 years that I've been going. Never. What I have done is I pulled the rolling stock off probably a good half a dozen times and clean the wheels. So I would get all that ugly gray buildup on the wheels, get out the IPA, get out the Q-tips, and start cleaning wheels. My personal observation is the P2K wheels, the older ones, tend to pick up more gum than Intermountain wheels. I really am not a big fan of KD wheels because of the black, and the blackening ends up getting out on the track. Each operator is different, so you need to consider that. People need to be able to exercise some freedom there. I used to operate at a local railroad, though he's no longer with us, but he would yell out when people were going to run a switch, or hey, you're not doing this. And there's a little bit too much micromanagement. So if I see somebody's going to run a switch, I actually let them run the switch, because it's not going to hurt the railroad the way the railroad is designed. And realistically, it's going to give them an opportunity to, wow, I got to make sure I figure that out. Cabs and cables will fail. Had plenty of throttle failures and cable failures. Cables get stretched. So that was one of the big things of going to radio, is that the cables don't get stretched as much. Tape that I use in the car cards will fail. Now I'm about one to two car cards every time I stage the railroad where the tape has ripped. Ongoing maintenance program is critical to problem-free operations. So it's painfully obvious, but realistically, it's really paid off. I've tried to be very diligent on that. And don't fix or change the railroad the day before a session, despite what I said. Now, on my example of adding the new section in before Desert Ops, the first session, everything came up fine. We ran the railroad until one person shorted in the new room, and then the PSX wouldn't reset. And we looked around, tried to figure out, it turned out that I'd reversed the input and output wires. So for whatever reason, it powered up okay, but then it wouldn't reset. So that was a quick fix that I was able to do to get that resolved. Coupler springs will go missing. Free the springs. I've had a guy's a friend, he's operating, he came here for one of the Desert Ops sessions, and no kidding, during the session, he liberated at least 5 coupler springs. I don't know what he was doing. And I asked him, are you picking the spring or are you picking the coupler? So during the sessions, if I lose a coupler spring, I'll generally pull the car off immediately, quickly replace the spring and try to get it back in service. Operators may take home cards or packets. Knock on wood, I've not had this problem, but it's always something that I've been aware of. One of the ways my jobs work is less likely is because you finish at a set destination and you put your cards in the pocket as the completion of the job. Hasn't happened. I still wait and know that it will at some point. I moved to foam core buildings. I have some plastic buildings on the railroad, some different kits, but I did a lot of foam core where I just used the foam core, made the building, and then put a facade on it that I printed, which was basically the Walters buildings that somebody had digitized. It works really well, and it's been a long time that I've been operating with foam core, and I can tell you I'm probably never going to get to 100% real buildings. Don't start off too complicated, evolve over time. So as you're bringing the railroad up, you don't want to make the job so complicated that people are intimidated by it. So you can continue to add things to make the railroad more complicated. And that's one of the things that I've done, as you hear me talk about some of the things I've tried that didn't work, reprinting waybills so I get better balances, etc. Feedback is a gift. I had a boss that used to say that all the time and drove me nuts. I do like getting feedback. Now, one of the interesting things that I had a group come in from out of town. This is when I was still with 57-foot cars. They said, if you lengthened all your spurs by just an inch or two, it'd make these jobs a lot easier. I said, yeah, that is the case. They said, but railroads are cheap and they're not going to lengthen sidings or spurs unless they absolutely have to, or the industry's going to pay for it. And then time spent focus on operational reliability will pay off time and again. And I truly, truly believe that. Pick a day and keep it. If you're going to host on Tuesdays, keep it on Tuesdays. I've personally vacillated between Mondays and Tuesdays, but now I've settled on Tuesdays because the other railroads that are operating in the area, they can start to consistently plan around that. So we get to a point where we have somebody else who wants a Tuesday. Now we know I operate on the first and third Tuesdays as a general rule. So that seems to be working out pretty well. What would I have done differently? I would have gone to radio throttles sooner. I'm pretty happy with the radio throttles now. I would have refined my operator pool sooner. I struggled with some of those operators that I want to be inclusive. I want people to come and I want them to enjoy the railroad, but there are just some folks that just don't get it. It just doesn't work well. Spend time working on equipment sitting in boxes. So we all have equipment squirreled away somewhere. I wish I'd spent a little bit more time working on that equipment prior to bringing up the railroad so that I could that didn't become a distraction. Spent more time on finishing the railroad. So it took me quite a while before I got skirting. That was a Christmas present from my wife at one point was, hey, I'm going to make the skirting for your railroad, which turned out fantastic. Getting the fillers in my corner, getting the fascia up. That took a long time. It's all done now. I'm very happy with it. I use black as my fascia color, black as my skirting color. You know, everybody's got a different philosophy on that. For me, I like it because it just kind of vanishes. And then working on scenery, I went from everything being painted gray to most being painted brown, with the exception of underneath the rails. But I haven't gotten around to painting the track yet. I'm a little hesitant because I've had a number of experiences with folks that they painted the track and it didn't operate as reliably. My operational reliability has been such a focus that that's been one of my excuses, if you will. And then next up, I'll probably end up doing a little bit more scenery. You'll also note in the picture, one of the things that I did that I'm fairly happy with is I put a card sorting slot in the fascia. So that was simply constructed to put in another piece of masonite behind the main fascia panel, which created a 1/8 inch slot all the way, or most parts around the layout. Quick little commercial. So I am the creator of cab savers for the NCE throttles. Those are for 04 and 06 P cabs. I don't know if you've ever had to replace a pot, but usually that comes because it rocks. So these are acrylic discs that fit down around the pot housing and allows you to keep the knob from rocking. You know, I used my thumb on the side of it as well. And what the genesis of this was, I had a brand new throttle fail first session out of the box. So again, some of the things, they also work for easy DC throttles, although I think their pots are a little bit more robust, got different colors, blah, blah, blah. Reach out to me if you're at all interested in that. And with that, here's my email and the link to my blog, and we can open it up for questions.
All right, thanks so much, Rick. So we don't have anybody complaining. Rick was kind enough to present. He did ask me about promoting his product prior to doing so. So if you have a complaint about that, reach me privately. But I got no issue promoting another hobbyist product. So let's see, moving through the questions. Somebody was asking about HomaBed. That was a product cut from HomaSote. Unfortunately, the company that made HomaBed is now out of business, as is the second company, Cascade Rail Products. Everybody's out of business now. So the next question is the SPINS diagram. What does that SPIN stand for?
Southern Pacific Industrial Numbering System.
There you go. Oh, and somebody got that. Burr is asking for card boxes by industry. Does that mean you have more than one box for a track with more than one industry served by that track?
Yes, I do. Yes,
okay. I do. All right. From Tom Bailey, did you develop your car cards in Excel from scratch, or did you use a template from somebody else?
There was, I think it came from Germany. I went to a presentation on one of our local division meets, and somebody had it. A lot of the words are in German, and then I modified it. It would show just the AAR the AAR code, the reporting mark, and the car number, and I expanded that a little bit to try to ease it for the operators. Put in that it's a 40-foot reefer, that the color's orange, and then what the billboard. So instead of just saying PFE 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it also includes a specific Fruit Express. Just trying to help folks locate those cars a little easier.
Are you doing a 1 or 2 person crews?
One person.
One person. And Mark from Edmonton's also asking start time. Do you have an arrive after time and arrive before time?
I'm not sure what you mean. If that means for when we start the session, I usually tell folks arrive about 5 to 10 minutes before the session.
Okay.
Most of the folks operate regularly. If you're a new operator, I usually ask you to show up about 20 minutes before so I can give you a brief orientation.
Okay, got it. There was a question about, let's see, do you pull the waybills after a complete cycle and route the empty offline to storage? Or
No, I flip between 1 and 2. You know, that, as I mentioned, if it's an orange 40-foot ice reefer and it's a Pacific Fruit Express, of which most of them are, moving it off the railroad and bringing in a different car doesn't really matter, because it's just going to be another reefer that has to be processed.
Okay. Dave, let's see. How does the operator get points? I think that was in your who gets first pick discussion.
Yeah, so the point system works that if you, I look at what people's total accumulated points over time, and it's an average, and then I sort it by highest to lowest. The person with the highest amount of points gets pick one, then number two is they get or one, 2, 3, 4, 5 down the line. And how that works is that if you got lowest pick last time, you'll have a higher amount of points than somebody who had a higher pick. So that's how it actually cycles through pretty effectively.
Got it. All right. Let's see. Somebody asking, have you considered a bad order card system?
I haven't. I usually if something gets broken, I'll set it aside. It ges put over in an area on the railroad, and it usually gets shopped before the next session.
Yep. Somebody asking here about the track plan. That's up on if you go to the invitation that was sent out, Rick, can you type your URL into the chat, the Blogspot site? I don't have that.
Oh, I don't remember it.
Oh, well, I'll find it.
I get it off my email. You can find the plan for the Exeter branch there. I'm guessing, Eric, you're going to post the presentation at some point too.
Yeah,
that's in there. But
it's okay.
The blog is a little bit more about the new railroad than the old railroad. My plans for the new railroad are there, and I do cover things on the SP Exeter branch as well.
Here, I'll throw the link out here. So that's I guess it's the old site. So let's say there's some discussion about the Katy couplers. Do you deal with off-spot cars?
Yes. So
okay.
I keep off spots. There's an off-spot card, and you put that in the card pocket with the card in front of the off-spot card. Some people end up putting the off-spot card in the actual car card pocket. That's fine. I don't get worked up about that.
And do you have shelves to help crews sort cards without putting them on the layout? Sounds like you got like a little groove type of
exactly. Yeah, that was in that last picture.
Yep. Yeah. All right. Let's see. With your point system, there's a couple of questions about how do you earn points? Is it attending and not being a screw up, basically, or?
No, the points it's solely based on if you attended. It's not based on performance or anything like that. It's if your first pick for this session, then that's 1 point. If your second pick, that's 3 points. Third pick, 5 points. And I did the bigger variation to give myself point total variation. And so again, it's a very simple system. You get 1, 3, 5, 7, 9 points, and then the next session that you're at, your total is sorted against the other operators that are in the session, and whoever has the highest amount of total points gets first pick.
So over time, it's going to rotate around. If you were the last, then you're going to be the next. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's see. I think that's. Let's see. With one card, let's see. Let me read this properly. With one card box per industry, how do 2 trains through the same town know what to work? Do they have car routing or train instructions?
2 trains don't service the same town. It's, well, I should back up. When it's the SP and the Santa Fe, the SP, I think I neglected to point that out. There's a banner across the top of the waybill that's either highlighted in gray or blue. The gray cars are SP cars, the blue cars are Santa Fe cars. So that's how they can determine what they need to pick up.
Okay.
Now, to be honest with you, there have been times where the Santa Fe job went in and they picked up all the cars, and they said, "Well, I think I got too many cars." And I said, "Yeah, you picked up the SP cars."
Got it.
So,
all right. Well, I will put in a self-promoting plug. You were talking about one of your slides about setting up an event. I will put in a plug for my operatingsessions.com site for scheduling both individual and large scale events. Not that anybody's doing those right now, but there's a lot of stuff built in there to make it easier to host events. So Ken C.
Yeah, I'm reading that one
Okay.
about the points. So a new operator, the first session, I will usually pre-assign what their job is. I give them the easiest job on the railroad so they can get a feel for the railroad. Then that actually counts as a first point. So they got 1 point for that session. And then so the next time they would likely end up a seventh or eighth, or I'm sorry, a fourth or fifth choice. Based on that, I can manipulate it a little bit. You know, what I wanted the new people to have a good experience, right? And a sense of success.
Yeah, you've absolutely, there are several layouts where it's the seniority thing. Essentially, unless you've been at the layout for the last 20 years, you're not doing anything other than a road crew, and you're never going to get.
Exactly.
I like the idea of being able to rotate around and try new things.
Well, and what's your enthusiasm to go back, right? If you're always getting the same job.
Yep, exactly. And the idea of getting new blood in is important. So there's a question about, did you ever figure out a way to light the number boards on your Atlas loco?
Wow, you've been reading my blog. I thought about putting SMDs in, or surface mount LEDs, but I think I'm going to opt for the lazy way and just let it go. It just baffled me that Atlas made it so you could light the number boards but didn't provide you with enough room. I didn't feel like milling the weight.
Yeah. Pat's asking, what antivirus precautions do you take? I would hope masks are required, hand sanitizer elsewhere.
Yeah, I actually am not requiring masks. We're in Arizona, so like, call us cowboys, call us what you want. Well, especially since COVID has hit, what I've told folks, if you're not feeling well, please don't attend. If you want to wear a mask, you're more than welcome. My last session, one of the operators wore a mask. We obviously make people make sure their hands are washed. At break time, we pass out disinfecting wipes for people to wipe their hands. I actually have that at the end of break too, so that they don't get their grubby hands on the equipment. Usually the sessions run about 3.5 hours. We break for about a half hour in the middle, go upstairs, have some snacks, and then go back and finish running the railroad.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have to agree to disagree on the value of masks on that from the medical standpoint, but we're not going to get into that today. So what type welder do you use for your steel benchwork fabrication?
It's a Tweco MIG welder.
Okay.
So it's all MIG welding.
All right. And then just some more discussion about the points. I think it's basically just to randomize who gets to do what. So everybody gets a chance to be first eventually. So, all right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.